I have a question for you. What if we decide we want to end poverty by ending it? The government gives every citizen a monthly tax-free payment with no strings attached that is equal to a poverty threshold. Every person, rich or poor, whether willing or able to work or not, receives it. And we get rid of the government income supports under the current system, meaning no more welfare, food stamps, or disability supports. If you lose your job or become disabled, you'll still have this money to fall back on. And in return, and in order to pay for it, every dollar you obtain, in addition, by any means, is yours but taxed at 40%, whether the income comes from work, business profits, rental income, inheritance, whatever. Would you prefer it over the current system? Welcome to the idea of a universal basic income. A basic income is a periodic cash payment unconditionally delivered to all on an individual basis without means test or work requirement. This is the definition adopted by the Basic Income Earth Network. They mean all of those things individually. They mean periodic, cash, unconditional, and so on. I think of it as no longer having anyone start off as zero. I'll distinguish between two forms, the demogrant and the non-demogrant. The demogrant program, which fits the Basic Income Earth Network conception, is equal payment to every individual, even the wealthiest person. Non-demogrant means declining benefit as a percentage applying to those with incomes from other sources. This is the means by which they decide not to give a check to the wealthier citizens who really don't need it, and then tax it back from them and some more besides. The Alaska Permanent Fund has been operating since about 1982 as a demogrant, as a citizen's dividend from the profits. It's not designed as a basic income for the same purposes, but it is a form of it. If you answered yes to the question for starters, you affirmed one of the most expensive proposals. Why have a demogrant rather than a non-demogrant? The question is whether to give payments to those who do not need it, and then raise taxes to get the money back from them, and some more besides. Proponents of a non-demogrant UBI, such as those tested in pilot projects, argue for the lower cost and against the perceived unfairness of giving to the richest. However, these same people often support the principle of universality elsewhere. The same reason to give the wealthiest free healthcare and education that they could finance on their own exists also to justify giving them UBI payments. When some benefit is given to all, there is little or no support from the people in the middle to take it away from those at the bottom or make it suffer the death of 1,000 cuts. By contrast, a benefit that is targeted only to those who can prove that they need it is always vulnerable to political attack, as it stigmatizes those who receive it. One example of this is former Ontario Premier Mike Harris. He won 2 consecutive majority governments on his promise to cut welfare by over 20%, while promising to leave healthcare and education alone. There are also demogrant advantages in terms of simplicity and following the logic of having all citizens being equal. In terms of what it should replace, it replaces means-tested income supports, such as welfare, food stamps, disability programs. These programs are the opposite of UBI, and UBI does not share their problem of what might be called poverty traps, disincentive to work, what Europeans often call 100% tax. That refers to the phenomenon of it's not worth it to take a job because you'll lose your benefits. UBI advocates identify means testing as the problem rather than the solution. Where the program is a premium collecting insurance scheme to compensate unemployed or injured workers, that program should continue as long as it collects premiums. UBI is a different and separate thing from insurance schemes. Where adequate tax credits or pension supplements already exist for children and seniors, as they do in Canada, UBI for working-age people can be considered. And UBI advocates do not suggest replacing non-cash targeted programs, such as home care for the elderly or disabled, nor do we suggest abolishing non-cash universal programs of healthcare or education. This would only increase the poverty threshold in annual adjustments and result in a higher benefit check needed. What basic income is not, it's not a solution to all problems, we know that. We just don't accept this as a reason to not do it. In terms of people saying it's utopian or a pie in the sky, well, a lot of things get called that before they actually get put into place. It's not welfare. Without means test or work requirement means that it is not just for people who currently qualify for welfare, and it's not really about them at all. Unemployed, part-time, full-time, you all qualify. If you are currently one of the welfare bashers, well, you should support this idea under which every dollar you get from employment, every hour of work, puts you above the unemployed person. It is not a wage subsidy. Unemployed people get it without work requirement, while employers will face the same laws and the same unions as before. It is not communism. People who make this accusation only prove that they do not know what communism is. It is not classifiable into left-right thinking. Much of the logic of basic income is older than this kind of political spectrum analysis anyway. Its advocates in the U.S. include Martin Luther King, George McGovern, Richard Nixon, Milton Friedman, John Kenneth Galbraith. For anyone who says that it is a right-wing conspiracy or Trojan horse, there's someone else saying that it's a left-wing conspiracy. Thomas Paine is an important figure here. His pamphlet, published in 1797 under the title Agrarian Justice, contains an early form of UBI. He argued that in nature there can be no private ownership of land, which is nature's gift to all, that the lives of the non-landowners are made more miserable as a result of the private ownership, and that therefore it is a question of justice rather than charity, that landowners pay a ground rent to finance payments to all citizens, which will include themselves, of course, because they're part of all, and this makes it a democrat program. He used the term ground rent because he didn't know what else to call it. I would add that resources, governments that charter corporations, and the progression of knowledge through the centuries also belong to all of us as nature's inheritance. And in that spirit, I propose that UBI would instead be called natural inheritance payments or benefits, but it will probably still be called UBI. John Kenneth Galbraith is another important figure, 20th century economist. In his book The Affluent Society, he is often credited with inventing the phrase conventional wisdom, and is one of his most important works. Galbraith writes about the fixation with ever-increasing production of goods and services, with full employment of labor as well as capital as a benefit to workers as well as to the capitalist. This production obsession leads not only to the starvation of public services, but also to an advertising industry to artificially create more wants for more goods and services, and a credit industry to artificially create the wherewithal to purchase them. There exists a need to divorce production from income security and have a source of income unrelated to production. The reason is that production is inadequate as an instrument of welfare. So if an individual is employed under his idea, part of the payment is withdrawn above a certain level and is converted into a payment to the state. So this is a non-demogrant idea that he had put forth, not in the first edition of The Affluent Society, but in later editions. The MINCOME project was done in the Canadian province of Manitoba in the 70s. It was an experiment to see if a basic income would actually result in less workforce participation, as critics on the right often assume. Payments were about 60% of the poverty line, less 50% of additional income, so it was a non-demogrant idea. Although similar to the sign dime experiments in the U.S., it used the town of Dauphin in Manitoba as a saturation site, meaning that anyone in that town who wanted to could participate, while in other similar towns, people served as the control group. Primary breadwinners did not reduce their workforce participation. Teenagers stayed in or returned to high school in order to graduate, and new mothers extended their maternity leaves to the current entitlement. One possible explanation suggested as to why it did not reduce workforce participation, at least among primary breadwinners, is that people want more income than just what is necessary to survive. Health economist Evelyn Forget later found participants in Dauphin, did further research, and found hospital visits, accidents, and mental health issues were reduced by 8.5%. compared to other towns. There will be someone who still will say, "We can't give people money for nothing. People should have to work." Well, lesson one from Rich Dad Poor Dad is the rich don't work for money. And this book is not the first or only leakage of what has never actually been a secret. Too many people think that the only ways of getting money are work or welfare. They don't think of inheritances, investment returns, leverage, capital gains, and they end up assuming that because the rich are not on welfare, well, they must be working to deserve their incomes. Not the case. Through mutual funds, I have myself obtained money for nothing. That's how pension funds work. The investments earn money for you to replace your work income. If we made everybody work for money, the capital markets for stocks and bonds, well, they'd be shut down and modern capitalism would reverse back to small proprietorships, at least. In terms of the cost to taxpayers, of course, everybody wants to know about the cost. Many just assume that the cost of a UBI is to be calculated by taking the number receiving the checks and multiply that by the amount. This is the basis for annual costs of a demogrant version being floated around out there at $3 trillion in the US and a proportional figure of $50 billion in Canada. This three-card money operates by ignoring the fact that UBI is a transfer rather than a spending program. To illustrate this, imagine that Paul owes Ringo $3. He gives George $5 with instructions to get the $2 change for him. How much does this cost George? Well, obviously it doesn't cost him anything. But when George is the government and people hate Ringo, some of us just get retarded and are willing to believe that this transaction costs George $7 because that's the sum of what he takes from others. This is the logic that people use when they come up with these big cost figures for UBI. The real cost to the group is $3 that gets redistributed from Paul to Ringo. A government example is these family support offices in many jurisdictions that will collect child support payments that are garnished for people's paychecks by court order and then sending the money to the custodial parents. All of us agree that the cost of the government is the expenses of running the office. It's not the total of the money being redistributed. In terms of the cost to taxpayers, what it would be, most people would be net receivers. In the example above, Ringo pays $2 but gets $5. Thus, we say that he pays a negative income tax because he actually gains. Others above a break-even point will not be net paying at anywhere near the gross 40% I proposed in the first slide. The total cost to taxpayers turns out to be about a third of the scaremongering figures. I have included a link below that shows how, but the basic idea is you're not just paying, you're also receiving. So now we know there exists a good moral justification for UBI. The current paradigm of production and full employment is not sustainable, even without considering globalization and robots taking our jobs. Money for nothing is an essential part of the capitalist system anyway. Rich people get it, so why shouldn't poor people get it? UBI works in practice without creating some massive labor shortage, and it will not cost anywhere near what the opponents claim. So we look to the advantages. When set at an adequate level, it eliminates absolute poverty, at least in the sense of inability to finance basic needs. It saves the government costs of having poverty in eliminating expensive programs and lower health care and crime costs. The more modest proposals either pay for themselves or only increase government expenditures by around 5%, giving rise to the argument that we can decide to afford it. It frees the wage slave from having to sell his labor in order to survive. It forces capital to bargain without coercion. It eliminates poverty and welfare traps in the current systems by ensuring that employment always increases income. In fact, the working poor benefit most by now being allowed to double dip. It reduces or eliminates the stigma of welfare and political vitriol against the unemployed. The welfare mom and her spouse in the house just become another couple on the block. It recognizes contribution of housework and child rearing that are often done by women most of the time. It gives women greater freedom to leave an abusive husband. It frees people to do work or run a business that is not commercially viable. It gives workers greater power to manage their careers by holding out for a good job, going back to school, or starting a good job part-time until full-time becomes available. It gives compensation for the fact of the natural inheritance of the land and accumulated knowledge belonging to all of us, but is privately expropriated. It gives greater economic stability to farmers and small business owners. It provides an economic stimulus and stabilizer by putting a greater share of income into the hands of those who spend and will spend locally. It provides an adjustment to income inequality where corporations have no mechanism to ensure that they don't shoot themselves in the foot by bankrupting consumers. And there is, most of all, and this is a nice little bonus, there's the potential for a society to be less fixated on money and status, where people meeting might ask, "What do you like?" rather than "What do you do?" All that's really needed is political will. Thank you for watching.